Today I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I've had some people actually ask me about this, and if you're not one of them and you don't care, then just don't watch. I don't really care. But this video is going to be a little bit about how I design guitars. It's going to talk a little bit about the software that I use, because I do use a CNC now because I'm an evil heathen and I'm no longer a woodworker. And but more importantly, it's going to talk about sort of like some thoughts that I have about design that I think you might find useful translating into other aspects of design besides just guitars. I'm actually going to talk about cars a lot, and I don't know anything about cars. But so, strap in. I'll say real quick at the top that I don't have any formal training as an artist. I am what you would call an outsider artist or a folk artist, and this is just what I've discovered in my personal quest. So you may disagree with me. That's okay. I think cars are a great place to start when talking about design, because there's so many good and bad examples of design in cars, and there's something that we're all very familiar with. There's this sort of accepted proportion to a car that really goes back to Roman times, and the horse and carriages and the width and size, and every artist and designer wants to put their own mark on that car, but there's these limitations of proportion that they have to work within. So you can see here we have, like, in the 50s, the cars, compared to some of the older cars, you know, they got bigger and longer, and technology and materials and whatnot slowly changed the shape of the car, but they really are still related to these early cars you can see in the bottom right corner. So over the years, there have been some real flops in proportions, and that's like a very important part. And you can see some of these here that are just not proportionally right. This is a great example of this Aston Martin. It's got 4 doors, it's got a hood and a trunk, but it's just wrong looking, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and they're all just these subtle little things that just sort of make it off. And you can get real artsy with your designs. As you can see, here are some people that are making, you know, really interesting rat rods and hot rods, and these are artistic conceptions of where they're taking these proportions and elongating them and stretching them in drawings, but it doesn't always necessarily translate to the real car. Like, what these cars that look really cool in these drawings might not look as cool in person, although I think that truck would look cool no matter what you did with it. And guitars sort of fall into the same category of design. There's these certain expected proportions of guitars, and if you stray too far outside of them, you're going to have proportion issues. For example, here's a classic 4-door hatchback Dodge Omni. Not a beautiful car, but proportionally works, and you can see here, oh, I actually had one of those. They're tolerable, but let me show you an example of where things can go horribly wrong within this design. You can see that it's still a 4-door and it's about the same size, but that's just wrong. You can see this artist sketch of the car actually looked really nice, but then just something got lost in translation. And by the time they manufactured it, it was just a horrible design. Another great example is the SUV market. Like, nobody really loves looking at SUVs, but you can see there's examples here like this Audi that are beautiful designs. Even though it's maybe not my favorite car, it's very attractive looking and it's proportionally well balanced. What do we got coming up here? Here's some other versions of the classic 4-door SUV, and there's one that's not as attractive. The proportions of the windows aren't right. This looks pretty decent, and what else we got here? But we can go to the prime example of the worst. Oh yeah, those are terrible. The worst designed one of these. And just talk about getting proportions wrong. This has kind of become a cult classic almost. It's so ugly, it's kind of cool because it's so ugly, but make no mistake, it's ugly. And why? Because it's strayed too far from the norm and the proportions are wrong. So now we look at some guitars, and these are some of the classic, standard, basic guitar bodies. We have the Gibson Les Paul. There's a single cutaway guitar. Telecasters are another single cutaway guitar. These are standard, tried and true electric guitars. They've been around since the beginning. They're all the guitars that set the standard, whether you like them or not. These are the guitars that set the standard for the design. And so anybody that wants to make another guitar needs to be aware of these proportions and keep them in mind as they go. And here's some examples of some guitars that are, you know, working within those proportions that you may or may not like. Obviously, taste plays a factor in all this stuff. And people try to push the envelope. I'm one of them. We push the envelope and we look for ways to reinvent things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
there's going to be a market for some of these guitars. This one, you can see the proportions are off. It's too big in the back. The horn's too long. Beautiful wood, but it's lacking. You know, some of these guitars are, you know, obviously sort of artsy types of ideas and designs. Some of them are marketed towards certain types of music. Personally, I've always liked the Japanese import guitars of the 60s and 70s that were taking some of these proportions and playing with them, and I thought they did a pretty good job. I think that some of them are like that ugly, so ugly they're beautiful, and some of them are just beautiful. I get a lot of inspiration from them when I'm designing. But in this video today, I'm going to design a bass guitar, so we're going to jump ship over to the classic bass shapes. Here's your classic Fender Precision bass and your Fender Jazz bass, and pretty much every bass is related to these in some way, whether they like it or not. There's another Fender bass that was kind of more like the Japanese style, where it got a little shrunken and a little more unique looking. Now, bass guitars, there's a lot of fetishists in the market for basses, and there's this trend that was in for a while where they put this really large piece of wood across the top. Basses seem to be really into this, like all these like fancy quilted woods and these extra long horns, and this elongated and extra large and extra stretched out and liquidy shape really came in vogue in the 90s, which is when I first started making basses, and some of my first basses kind of had that look and feel to them. Since my style has changed and my interests have changed, but today I want to design a bass that sort of fits in with that style, because there's a lot of people that still like them, but I also wanted to match my current line of bass guitars. Now, this all stemmed from an email I got from a potential customer who was interested in a particular design bass made by a very famous bass maker, Carl Thompson, who is probably one of the pioneers in this style. When Primus hit the scene in the 90s and Les Claypool was playing a Carl Thompson bass, all of a sudden that became the bass that everybody wanted, because everybody wanted to be like Les Claypool. Mr. Claypool has since gone on and started his own bass company called Pachyderm Basses, which you can see here, and he's made his own designs off of that. So I want to design a bass that is inspired by these Carl Thompson and Les Claypool Pachyderm basses, but I want it to fit my line, and of course the materials I use will fit in with my ethos and whatnot. And I don't want to just copy their design. Like, I just want it to be inspired by that. But what I mean by inspired is I like I want to do a bass with the long horn on the top, instead of like the shorter top like all my other instruments are right now. And I really just want to expand my product line and add another bass to the family. So I just downloaded this picture of this, and then I went back and I looked at a bass that I had made a few years back that was in that style. This was my design that I want to take now, and I want to modernize it and change it a little bit. I've done this one for a while, but there's some things about it I don't like, and this is before I was in the digital world, so now I can import this shape and this style into the digital realm and continue to develop it, which is what I'm going to do today. I use Aspire by Vectric to do all my CNC work, and I actually just use it to design too. Some people might choose to use Illustrator or whatnot for doing their 2D drawings and then bring it in to make it 3D, but I just draw in it because I don't have Illustrator, and I like learning the program. I feel like this is a good way. So I just opened up, created a new file, and I took one of my other bass guitars. I later bring some other body designs into to have them for reference to work off of, because to me it's important that there's a family and there's a relationship between the instruments that I make. So I'm starting with one of my basses instead of starting with this Pachyderm bass. Now, what I just did is I was able to grab the Pachyderm bass and then create vectors just by taking the picture and getting those lines. I'm not going to use them because they're all cruddy, because I didn't put any effort into it. You can see they're all mishmashed and it's not really usable, but it gives me something to work with. The other thing I could do is I could take that picture and I could trace it, but I decided not to do that as well. You see, I'm showing you could start and clean it up, but it's just too much work. It's not worth it. It's easier to just trace it or make your own shapes, but I just left that there for reference, and I got to work. So now I have proportions for this bass that I designed that I like, and I'm working within that realm, and I just start moving around actual points and pixels. This isn't efficient, but I'm not trying to be efficient. I'm just trying to experiment to see when I pull things in certain directions, what happens to the overall proportions of the instrument. And that's why I keep zooming in and out, and I'm just putzing about it. What I just did there is I actually backed my way through all the work I did back to the original bass, and so I looked at it again in reverse. Now I'm dropping in that rough sketch I have, and I'm sort of messing around with the points in that and mixing them with the body I have. Again, it's not really about efficiency, it's about like looking at the two things on top of each other and next to each other and experimenting with the shapes. I don't want to copy it exactly, and so I'm just not really sure exactly what I want to do yet. Where do I want to add weight? Where do I want to take weight away? And always relating it back to my original design that I like, that I want it to be related to. Now here I just jumped ahead quite a bit. You can see I brought in another body design of mine into the image. And now I'm a little bit closer to, this is after, you know, a good hour of messing around, which would just be boring to watch here. I'm pretty close now on the shape that I want. I took cues from the base that I'm inspired by, the pachyderm base on the horns, but then I took away some of their key signature shapes and I changed them a little bit to make them more mine. But more importantly, the bottom half of the base is making reference to my designs, and I feel like I came up with a shape that's pretty well related. I'll zoom out again in a minute and you'll be able to see them all next to each other. And right now I'm just creating a pick guard to go with it, that I'm taking the shape of the instrument and then shrinking it down and changing it and modifying it to something that looks good. And this is the same thing now. It's not, again, it's not efficient. It's about looking at proportionally what I think works and experimenting, moving points around. And here you can see what I've come up with. You can see two of my designs to the left, as well as the one that I'm inspired by on the right, and something that's somewhere in between that I think looks pretty cool. But it's still just on a computer screen.
Now, personally, my brain works in 3D, and I'm a tangible kind of guy, so for this to mean anything to me, I need to actually cut it out. So I simply cut it out of my laser cutter, out of this like 1/8 inch just hardboard. This isn't really any different than if you were to do this type of work without a computer. The difference is you would use a pencil and paper instead of the computer, and then you could simply draw or transfer your paper onto some material like this and cut it out to get yourself a physical template. If you were to not have the CNC machine and want to continue from there, you could use this template. If you cut these parts out all the way, you could use this template now with a bearing router bit and actually cut out your guitars. The thing I like about holding this now is I can actually get a sense of scale of how it would sit on a human body. I can take physical pieces of hardware and line them up and put them on, put pickups on, put knobs on, and figure out in the real world how I think this will look best. And the other thing I can learn by cutting this out is I can see things like this, like there's a little bit of a problem in my coding here. This is a little sharp. If I were to cut this out on my router instead of my laser, it would probably just smooth out because the bit would be large enough anyways. But I can find little things like that I want to fine tune and have an actual guitar in my hands. You know, so now before I make any decisions, I'm going to live with this for a couple days and see if I like it. I can already tell by just hanging it on the wall and looking back that this is just a little too pointy for me. I need to round that out a little bit more and make it match that one. So, a couple little edits. Well, I hope you found that interesting and useful, and if not, I'm sorry I wasted your time. But thanks very much for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe, and you can see more videos on this channel about woodworking and design in a practical matter, and not so much like this like kind of talky matter. Not really planning on doing more videos like this. I just wanted to do this one. Like I said, there was some interest in it, and sometimes when you say things out loud, it helps reinforce and helps you better understand yourself. So that was for me as much as you. All right, thanks a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also support me over on Patreon at patreon.com/TimSway. And I'll see you around the interweb. Be good.